Welcome to Disarming Leviathan, a podcast designed to equip you to missionally engage American Christian nationalists. For more info on today's guest and our suite of resources, visit disarmingleviathan.com.
All right, Nijay, you wrote this book, Strange Religion, looking at the earliest followers of Jesus and how they navigated life in the Roman Empire. What do we need to know about those first churches, especially as we're thinking about living as Christians in America today?
Yeah, thank you. Really, there were two inspirations for the book, one kind of more academic, one more cultural. The academic was, I've been doing a lot of work on Paul's faith language, and someone asked me, were the Christians the only ones to call themselves believers, or were there other religious groups that did that? And that started me down kind of a rabbit hole of how weird the early Christians were compared to other religious groups of the time. People in the ancient world were very religious, and there was kind of big state religion, and then there was kind of personalized religious preferences and hobbies and interests. And I just kind of found this thread that continued to unwind of how backwards and upside down these Christians were. We'll get into that in a minute. But the cultural side is, I live in Portland, Oregon, one of the most unchurched, maybe even anti-Christian parts of the United States. And when I talk to my neighbors here, and I ask them about their views on Christianity, they'll say Christians are judgmental, hypocritical, closed-minded, greedy, narcissistic, sexist, racist. I mean, they will say that Christians reflect and amplify the worst of American culture. Because they're listening to the news, they're watching the news, they're seeing, LA preachers with expensive sneakers, they're seeing, a mega church pastor trying to buy an $86 million Learjet for comfortable travel overseas. They're seeing scandals, sexual scandals, abuse scandals galore. And that doesn't represent every single Christian, but that's the sort of reputation Christianity has where I live. And in other parts of the world too that are heavily unchurched, like Europe. And yet, like, my day job is I study the Bible, especially the New Testament. When I read the New Testament, I see a group of Christians, especially apostolic Christians. There are lots of naughty Christians in the Bible, but apostolic Christians who are, give of themselves to the poor, who, love their neighbor, who gave up so much in order to follow Jesus. And I thought, what is really the disconnect there? What is happening? So I thought, one of the sort of backgrounds that's laying in the background of the book is the question: would our spiritual ancestors, the first Christians, consider us today their true descendants?
Wow.
And I would answer probably no. Mostly no. Mostly no. And I think, we could get into the details, but when people ask me what went wrong, where did we go wrong? I feel like in many ways, popular culture is like a big magnet. And it draws you into just the way things are. You don't think about it. It's like a fish in water. They don't think about it. You're just going along with what sort of this is. And it takes something powerful to pull you away from that. And so if it's normal to steal staples at work, if it's normal to, raid the fridge when you weren't supposed to at work, what's going to stop you from doing that? If it's normal to cheat on the timesheet, if it's normal to clock in late, what's going to stop you from doing that? It's going to take something pretty powerful, because culture is this stream that's running in one direction. Not all things in culture are bad. There are some really wonderful things in American culture. And then there are also things that all of us would consider less than ideal, especially when we visit other countries, that sort of thing. So what I really want to do is get into, number one, what really were the early Christians like? What did they value, and why? And then number two, how is it that they actually distinguished themselves from the wider Roman culture? And those were the kind of pieces that went into this book.
So thinking about that distinction, today I hear words like, are you religious or not religious?
Right.
Would that have made sense to someone in the Roman Empire in the first century?
Generally speaking, no, but kind of yes. So you wouldn't really ask someone, are you religious? Because everybody's religious except a really small group of philosophers who were kind of poo-pooed by everybody else. There were a few kind of know-it-all sort of philosophers that were kind of like, oh, there are no gods.
Sure.
And they either got condemned or exiled or whatever. But by and large, everybody was. It's kind of like, maybe not everywhere in the U.S., but it's kind of like sports.
Okay.
Well, let's do it this way. It's kind of like saying to somebody in America today, do you like music? Everybody likes music.
Got it. Right.
You may meet one in 1,000 that will say, I just turn the radio off when I get in the car and I don't listen. That's kind of crazy, right? We all listen to something. So it's like, it's not, do you listen to music? It's what music do you like? And then, I like country or I like rap or, that sort of thing. But I will say the place where it might make sense to ask, are you religious, is some people were really fanatical.
Okay.
So the Roman religion, so this is really important because we don't really have exactly the same thing today in the United States. So the Roman Empire was just this huge machine, one of the most efficient machines, social machines in all of history. And their goal was conformity, power, conquest, and prestige. They wanted it all. Usually you could have one or two of those things. They wanted it all. And so in order to be powerful and extremely large, you had to have conformity mechanisms. You had to get everybody to toe the line. And so think about Roman culture as a huge pyramid of power. So you have a few people at the very top that have a lot of power, like the emperor, you have senators, the senatorial class, you have the equestrian class. And then towards the bottom, you have commoners, the regular folk. We would say blue collar maybe. And then below that, you have slaves, foreigners, and criminals, at the very bottom of society. And Rome's desire was to maintain that equation, that there are few powerful, wealthy people at the top and the great mass at the bottom, but that everybody was trying to strive to go up a notch. You couldn't go up a whole lot, but you could go up a notch. And a religion was part of that. Roman religion was designed as part of this pyramid where the Roman gods were at the very top. And the idea wasn't that you should have a deep, heartfelt love for God. They didn't care. You had the Roman gods. We might know them as Zeus, but they had Roman names like Jupiter and Neptune, Mars, so forth. And the idea was something in Latin called pax deorum, which means keeping peace with the gods. The gods were not family. They weren't friends. They were cosmic overlords. And your job was to appease them no matter what. So everybody did what was expected to keep peace with the gods, or else you would get struck by lightning, or you lose a war, or you get raided by pirates, or, there was all this stuff that could happen if you didn't keep the gods happy. So on one level, religion was just keeping the overlords happy.
Okay.
Staying out of their business, paying your taxes, which meant sacrifices and offerings and oaths and festivals, and just not stepping on any toes, not making yourself too prominent. But then there's a whole other side of religion. There was kind of fanaticism, just like we have with sports. Like we all kind of watch the Olympics and we're all kind of interested, but none of us are obsessed with the Olympics. We all kind of watch it, but we're not like all year round. We're not like, let's follow these people. But then with our local sports, we get crazy. Like I'm a big soccer fan, so I go really crazy. Like I support the national team and all that, but I go crazy for my local. And it would be like that in the Roman world, where you would support the national gods, Jupiter and so forth. But some people get really, really crazy about their local gods, really zealous, and say, Artemis of the Ephesians is the best of the best of the best, that sort of thing. So that did happen. So everyone was religious, and some people were a little bit kooky.
Is that how does that intersect with, I don't know what word to use here, like an ethnocentrism, like my people and my God, or our people and our God are the best? Do those things intersect at all?
Absolutely. So you do have kind of two things happening at once. Rome allowed foreign religions to come into the empire. You have Judaism, you have Egyptian religion, you have Iranian sorts of religions, you have mystery religions, you have all kinds of stuff. And Rome was tolerant and accepting because their belief was, hey, the more gods, the better, the more blessings, the more powers, the more opportunities, with one proviso. The proviso was whatever gods that come in have to Romanize. They have to find their place within the Roman pantheon. So they can't claim supremacy. They can't claim, so you could say Isis, which is Egyptian god. Isis is great. You could even say the best, but you couldn't make a direct comparison to Jupiter. You could say my god is the best, but then if a Roman, soldier said, but Jupiter's the actual best, you'd be like, oh yeah, Jupiter's the actual best.
Sure, right, yeah, right.
But you could say that. So they had a tolerance policy, but it's kind of like America with sort of immigration where, okay, we want to let people in, but the expectation is they got to come in the right way. They got to come in with the expectation they're going to be pro-America, all of that. They had that view towards gods. We'll let almost anybody in if they're going to be a productive member of society. And as long as in Rome, they would express it as long as they would Romanize.
Yeah.
Everything support the glory of Rome.
So you can fly your flag just as long as it's lower than the flag of the empire.
Lower.
Yeah.
Slightly lower than the flag of the empire.
Yeah,
absolutely. So Jews got themselves in a little bit of trouble because they're monotheists and they believe in one God. And so there's actually a case where, Roman officials wanted to bring an image of Caesar, kind of like an idol, but an image of Caesar into Jerusalem as sort of a salute to the emperor. And because Jews knew that people worship the emperor, not everybody, but some people do worship the emperor as someone with divine status or divine-like status, Jews were really upset about this. And they actually said, just kill us all rather than force us to commit apostasy against our God. And so Jews, in Jerusalem actually made a deal. They cut a deal with the Romans and they said, we won't offer a sacrifice to Caesar, but we'll offer a sacrifice to our God for Caesar, asking our God to bless Caesar. And that was seen as kind of there were so many Jews in so many places of the empire. This was seen as kind of a gimme. This was kind of like, okay, Jews, keep your head down. Don't start a war, which they ended up doing.
Yeah.
Don't start a war. Don't go crazy about this. We'll just let you quietly worship your God. There was a little bit of a tolerance for that because Jews had an ancient religion. They had a respected temple. So they said, okay, we'll let you get away with this. So they just kept a check on them. They kept an eye on them.
Yeah.
Until they destroyed their temple.
Yeah. It sounds to me like the demand for devotion to the God of Rome is about what we might call like political or civic allegiance. Like we need to know that you're falling in line, that you're going to do what the emperor says, that you're going to get on board with the emperor's program. And one of the ways that you show us that you're going to do that is you make an offering to, the ultimate God, or you give devotion to the ultimate, Jupiter, whoever. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, but it's interesting. You had the Roman Republic, and then you had the Roman Empire. And once you have and a lot of this tracks with Star Wars, which is funny.
Oh, okay. I like this.
It does track with Star Wars because you have the Republic and then you have the Empire. So when you get to the Empire, which is around the time of the New Testament, which makes me wonder if this has to do with at the right time Jesus came.
Yeah.
Because you start to see kind of a war of powers happen between Jesus as Lord and other lords. Anyway, so once you have the Empire, then all of a sudden worship gravitates, it kind of centralizes towards the emperor. And so you have some really interesting things happening in the first and second century. You have Caesar Augustus, which is the first kind of real emperor. You had Julius Caesar before him, but you have Caesar Augustus. And what ends up happening is yes, Jupiter is the greatest, but now Jupiter is being worshipped alongside Roma, which is the goddess who represents the spirit of Rome. So now you have temples in honor of Roma, which is basically representing the Roman Empire. So now people are worshiping the spirit of the empire. And then you have kind of power collecting, more and more power collecting, centralizing with the emperor. And now you have statues of Jupiter in the dress of the Roman emperor. Or you have the Roman emperor actually dressing in the garb of Jupiter. So now you start to see an alignment between the human / divine emperor and the greatest god. So now it gets fuzzy. So Virgil, who was a famous writer, poet, he was super pro empire and super pro emperor. And he really felt like the move to an empire, to move to one great emperor with all power, which sounds like Palpatine, right? The emperor with great power. This is a divine blessing. Like this is fate. Fate has decided that this person will restore the glory of Rome. And so he actually, in Virgil, in one of his writings, he says, Jupiter rules in heaven and Caesar rules on earth. Basically saying these are twin superpowers. These are the twin superpowers of the universe. That's actually, my phone just beeped and it's a Star Wars.
This is perfect.
So, anyway,
excellent timing.
So what's fascinating is you have a blending of religion and politics in the Roman world. You had that before, but now you have it to the nth degree, where to worship Jupiter is to worship Caesar and the empire, and to honor Caesar is an act of ultimate allegiance and worship.
In the lives of the average person living under the Roman Empire, what would that devotion look like?
I mean, it's everywhere, just like we have school pledges of allegiance.
Okay.
And I actually see this I think it kind of declined, in the between when I grew up in the early 80s and maybe between the 80s and the late 90s. I think it declined a bit. And then it's come back in kind of a big way, right? But in the Roman Empire, you would have that everywhere. You would have songs and oaths and pledges at, like, we have like the Rotary Club, that sort of thing. Well, they had those things. They're called Greco-Roman voluntary associations. So they would do pledges of allegiance. You had military parades. Like, we have some of those. They have them all the time, because think how many conquests Rome went on.
Sure.
So they have military parades all the time. This is really crazy. Think about this. If you're a Roman city, if you're a city in Rome, your ultimate desire is to become a Roman colony. Why would you want to become a Roman colony? You get more soldiers in your city to protect the city from criminals, pirates, raiders, conquest, whatever. You have lower taxes. They'll build things in your city like amphitheaters, gymnasiums, stadiums, sports arenas, all that. So if you become a Roman colony, you get a huge upgrade. Financially, prosperity. You'll get a visit from the emperor every now and again. So how do you do that? How do you get to be Roman colony? You kind of lobby and apply for it. And one of the key things they're looking for is devotion to the emperor. So if you prove through parades and ceremonies, you make every 10th day a holiday to so-and-so, and, you put up pictures and all of that, statues. So, think about this machine of Rome. It ends up feeding itself, right? So you prove yourself pro-Roman, and then they give you more Roman stuff.
Yeah, sure.
But everybody wants it. So you do it by oaths, you do it by temples dedicated to Caesar, all this stuff. It's a huge machine that keeps feeding itself.
So this is like that magnet you talked about, the magnet of culture pulling in a direction.
Yeah.
And the Jesus followers in that type of environment
Yes.
are now going against the magnet. So they're saying,
yes,
Jesus is Lord. And
Yes.
some of the early, pastors would write to their congregations and say things like, hey, don't give into that old way of being or the kingdoms of this world, or, they had that kind of, in fact, there's this book in the Bible, you've heard of it maybe, Revelation.
Yes.
This is
It's pronounced Revelations. No, I'm just kidding.
very popular actually in the 80s when both of us grew up,
Yes.
for not so great reasons, I think. There's a warning, though.
Kirk Cameron would disagree.
Well, he made his career, his second career on that. The warning in the book of Revelation seems to be, don't be tempted, don't be seduced, don't be drawn into the magnet. How do you see Revelation speaking to those early Jesus followers in light of Rome?
Yeah. I mean, this is the temptation. This is the temptation in the Bible. If you go back to the Old Testament, take a book like Habakkuk. You have a time when, I don't know all the details because I'm not an Old Testament scholar, but you have a time when Israel is feeling like, hey, we have all these surrounding nations that either want to destroy us or force us into slavery or colonization. And we're going to have to make a treaty with somebody. We're going to have to get in bed with somebody and worship their gods. That's sort of the corner they felt backed into. Whereas the covenant says, think about Exodus and Deuteronomy, especially when they're about to go in the promised land, the Canaanite land. And God's like, rule number 1, 2, and 3 is don't make a deal with the Canaanites, drive them out, don't worship their gods, don't worship their gods, don't worship their gods. And then what do? They go in there and they worship their gods. I mean, so you have Habakkuk's, and you have the famous, the righteous will live by faith, Habakkuk 2:4. And if you read that in context, the whole point is Yahweh is saying, you're going to be tempted to make a deal, to get in bed with somebody and worship their gods for your own protection, for your own power, for your own sovereignty, for your own community. He says, no, you can't do that. So this is the ultimate temptation in the Bible, is to say, I won't get in bed, but maybe I'll just kiss. Maybe we'll just, we'll cuddle a little bit. And so apocalyptic literature, which is based on prophetic literature, so apocalyptic would be Daniel. Apocalyptic would be Second Temple texts like First Enoch and Second Baruch and Fourth Ezra and things like that. These texts are all about giving you kind of a sci-fi version of understanding the temptation and destructiveness of trying to worship more than one God. And the other God that you shouldn't worship is often a political entity that's wooing you with money, power, security. So whenever I teach Revelation, I just taught a lecture on Revelation a week or two ago. And I don't know if you have Tim Gombas on your show, but you have to have Tim Gombas because he's the master. Good.
Friend of the show.
Good. We co-taught this course, and we talked about how if you find yourself confused and read the book of Revelation, ignore what the actual symbols mean, like dragon, beast, and just read it through the letters to the 7 churches. Because the letters to the 7 churches at the very beginning of the book of Revelation are all about how some churches are doing it well and some churches aren't. And the churches that aren't doing it well are assimilating. They're assimilating to culture. Think about this, Caleb. Think about Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
It's easy for us to look at another context and try to understand how Christians can be wooed into the wrong things, maybe even for the right reasons in their minds, right? So think about a country where they had lost the earlier war, they had signed the Treaty of Versailles, they'd done a lot of mea culpas, they'd lost a lot of national pride. And here this man comes in, Hitler, who has a strong personality, who uses strong words, and who says, we're going to bring back our country and bring back God, the power of God, in a very powerful way. Now, Hitler wasn't a strong believer in Jesus. That's pretty clear from a variety of things, including his obsession with the occult. But he talked a good game. He talked a great game. And he nationalized his program with the national church, the German national church, the Reich Church. And when I learned this from Stanley Hauerwas, when the German army went into war, on their helmets it said, "God is with us."
Yeah.
On their helmets. Think about that. They're waging war, and what they think, or at least what they're pitching, is a religious war.
Mm-hmm.
And that God is on their side. And so the temptation is always there. You know, most of us today, Americans, 99%, would be on the side of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who said this is not the way, right?
Sure.
But the question is, what if we were German? What
Right.
if we were German in the 1930s? I don't know if you know the story, maybe you do, and I'll feel silly that everybody knows it and I didn't until recently, but Jürgen Moltmann was, I think, 30 years Bonhoeffer's junior. And he was a late teenager when he was drafted into Hitler's army. Do you know this story?
No.
Okay. Jürgen Moltmann, this is amazing. So he lives in Hamburg and he gets drafted into the military to fight for Hitler, and he doesn't mind. He has to, but he doesn't mind because he doesn't have a skin in the game in his own opinion. He just doesn't want to die.
Right.
And so he wasn't religious. He wasn't Christian. He didn't claim to be. He was really into philosophy and other things. And lo and behold, this is the end of the war. The Allies raid Hamburg, and he surrenders. He surrenders immediately. It just says, "I don't want to die." And they take him in as a prisoner of war into the UK. And he's there. He's 3 years a prisoner of war. This is Jürgen Moltmann, amazing life. And he's not a Christian. And they're trying to reprogram these soldiers for Hitler. They're trying to deprogram them. Let's put it that way. They're trying to deprogram them. So Hitler's people had told soldiers, especially these youngins, that the talk about concentration camps was a Western lie. Was a Western lie to have people turn against his own people turn against him. So Moltmann didn't believe it. He didn't believe it. He didn't believe there were concentration camps. And even when they showed him newspaper clippings and they showed him pictures and they told him about eyewitness testimony, he still didn't believe it. And over time, he finally believed it. And he went into great despair. And the way it's described, he almost took his life because he just realized he was fighting for a monster. And a American missionary chaplain gave him a Bible, and he started reading it, and he became a Christian, and ultimately he became one of the most famous European theologians in all of history. And he ended up writing a book on the resurrection, the hope of the resurrection, to say, how do we rebuild after all of this? It takes people like Moltmann to challenge the narrative of Germany, to say we cannot swear allegiance to any entity besides Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
It's in our heart to want to, but this is the ultimate temptation. And I'll pivot to another German, one of my favorite, Ernst Käsemann, around the same age, I think, as Moltmann. And Käsemann was arrested in the 1930s, maybe. He was arrested for preaching on Isaiah 26. "O Lord, other gods have tried to be Lord over us, but you are Lord alone." And they realized this was maybe a semi-veiled threat against ultimate allegiance to Hitler. Hitler, I don't know if you know this, but Hitler had Mein Kampf placed on the altar in Reich churches.
Yeah.
And it was tolerated by Reich churches.
Yeah.
I mean, this stuff to me is wild, but if it can happen once in the world, it can happen again.
Yeah.
And the book of Revelation is trying. So I forgot away from my point here. The way that these Allied leaders were trying to deprogram Jürgen Moltmann, Revelation is theological way of doing that. How do we deprogram people? What you do is you unmask them.
Yeah.
So they're doing that by saying these concentration camps are real. Revelation is doing that by saying you unmask the goddess Roma, which is worshiping Rome itself, and you actually see the whore of Babylon. I know that's hard to hear, but virtually all scholars agree that the image of the whore of Babylon is actually the goddess Roma, the spirit of Rome.
Yeah. So that sounds like a them problem. Us thoughtful moderns.
Yes.
How do you see what lessons can we learn as Americans following Jesus in the year of our Lord 2025?
Yeah. The lesson we learn is that idolatry comes in many forms, and the most destructive are the subtle ones. So, when I visit India, I am not tempted at all to worship a Hindu god. I know better. I didn't grow up in that culture. I've zero interest in that. However, worshiping wealth, worshiping mammon is a massive vice. Worshiping myself, worshiping success or progress, can be that way. And there's a huge danger in worshiping an entity, whether it's my workplace or whether it's a country or whether it's a particular leader or even worshiping our pastor. I know a lot of churches where I am worried that the people, when they think of God, they think of their pastor. Because that's the only voice they hear. That's the only face they see, which is why I encourage pastors to share the pulpit so that people aren't fixated on one person. So I think people need to know it's human nature to gravitate towards someone or something like that magnet. And constantly, the reason why we have Deuteronomy 6:4, love the Lord your God, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, love the Lord your God, is because we want to worship other things. We want to worship other people. We want to worship other gods, but the most tempting ones are the ones you can't see with a statue. And so confessing ultimate allegiance every day through the Shema, through the Lord's Prayer, through the Apostles' Creed, through the Ten Commandments, are key ways that our earliest ancestors, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century AD, they maintained a very firm stance on this. So to give one example, because I think this will be clarifying, then we can get maybe more specific. But one of my favorite stories about early Christianity is Polycarp. So Polycarp was 2nd century Christian, early 2nd century Christian. And we have this great story of Polycarp. It's one of my favorite stories to tell because it's kind of humorous. So he's an old man, and he's going to be arrested for not worshiping Caesar, not worshiping Rome. And he says, you can either worship Rome or you can worship Jesus. You can't worship both. This was the stance of Polycarp and many early Christians, most early Christians. And so Polycarp gets taken to the Colosseum. The emperor's there. Think like Gladiator. It's a good mental image. Think Gladiator here. And so under threat of being burned alive or thrown to wild animals, Caesar says, he points to a group of Christians and he says, say to the Christians, away with the atheists. And Polycarp famously turns to the Roman crowds that are watching and he says, away with the atheists to the Romans. And then Caesar's like, burn him up. And Caesar said, you can only save your life if you swear to my spirit, which is the spirit of the emperor, which, remember, is symbolic of the spirit of Rome. The emperor is identified with Rome, and Rome is identified with the emperor. So to swear allegiance, and why did Polycarp not do that? Because Scripture clearly teaches that we swear allegiance to nothing but Jesus Christ. No entity, no person, nothing but Jesus Christ. There's a great story from early Judaism. It's a really wonderful story. I think it's in 4th Maccabees. But there's a great story where there's a tyrant, Antiochus Epiphanes. There's a tyrant, Greco-Syrian tyrant, who wants to get Jews to turn against their own God, turn against their own faith. And so they get this mother of 7 sons, and they say to the mother, we're going to kill your sons if you don't turn against God. And then after that, we're going to cut your guts out. And according to 4th Maccabees, she pulls out her own guts and throws them at him. She's like, take them, take my guts. And what this was signaling, and this is very Christian in terms of martyrdom traditions, is nothing is above God.
Yeah.
Not family, not country. Now, the way I look at it, Caleb, is what the Bible teaches us is if we swear singular and ultimate allegiance to Jesus Christ alone, we will be a good citizen. Philippians chapter 1. We will pay our taxes. We will participate in the civic good. We will respect others around us. All the good things that people want out of patriotism will happen if you swear allegiance. The added benefit of this is if your country goes off track, which happens from time to time, then because you've sworn only ultimate allegiance to Jesus, how to get them back on track. If you swear allegiance to a flag, what happens when that country goes off track?
Yeah.
You've sworn allegiance to the country, and you could get lost in figuring out how to make it right, because do you follow your leaders? Do you not? One way to look at this is Black Panther, one of my favorite movies. You have Wakanda, and you have the king of Wakanda, and he's being challenged by an evil rival, Killmonger, and then Killmonger so-called kills T'Challa, and then Killmonger takes over the country. So then the royal guard has to decide, is our allegiance to the new leader, Killmonger, who is evil, and yet he is the rightful leader because he won an open battle. He's the rightful leader of this country. Or do you swear allegiance to the old king and the old ways? And they're in this tension of identity. And I think for Christians, we won't be in tension with identity. Do we go the new way of the country or the old way of the country if our allegiance is only to Jesus?
Yeah.
So what I'd want to say to people is, Christians, if your allegiance is only to Jesus, you will be the greatest asset to your country that you could possibly be, because you'll be transformed by the Holy Spirit and you'll serve with grace and truth.
I love that. That's so good. Nijay, thank you so much for your work and for sharing it with us. I know that I have gained a lot from your scholarship and your thoughtful writing, and I know it's been a blessing to our congregation as well here in Phoenix. So where can people find you and your work?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I have a podcast called Slow Theology. It's co-hosted with Dr. AJ Swoboda. He's a theologian. And we talk a lot about the really tough stuff of the Christian faith, how we deal with doubt, how we deal with complex and messy issues in life. And we want to turn people back to Jesus, back to the long obedience in the same direction as Eugene Peterson has wisely said. Also, I have a Substack called Engaging Scripture, where you'll learn more about the Bible. You'll get book reviews. You'll get tips on new books, great new books coming out. So those are great ways to check the work I'm doing out.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, it was great chatting with you.